The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, Roger Lea MacBride, is the author of Little House on Rocky Ridge. This book continues the saga of Rose Wilder Lane, daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose beloved series of books, Little House in the Big Woods, Little Town on the Prairie, describe pioneer life in the Midwest. MacBride discusses his friendship with Rose Wilder Lane and talks about his writing. Roger, it's a pleasure to have you here today on All About Kids, and we'll be talking about primarily your brand new book, Little House on Rocky Ridge, which is a sort of continuation of the wonderful series, Laura Ingalls Wilder books, starting out with Little House in the Big Woods. Before we talk about this book, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you got so involved and so committed to the Wilder family, and particularly Rose Wilder Lane, who was Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter.
Well, Rose was an extraordinary person, Gretchen. I met her when I was 17 and she was about 60, because my father was an editor of the Reader's Digest and had condensed one of the books she wrote in later life. And he thought she was fascinating and could teach me a lot. And I had the same kind of curious mind about affairs and ideas that Rose in fact had, and she recognized that. I used to hitchhike from our home in New York near the Digest to her then farm in Connecticut, small farm, on Saturdays, and weed her gardens and help clear her sheds out and stuff like that in the afternoon. In the evening, she'd cook her famous chicken pie for me. They don't pronounce the E in Missouri, they call it chicken, or at least she did. And we would talk until 1 or 2 in the morning about all the things that a 17-year-old wanted to ask an older, wiser person. Stories about everybody she knew, from Jack London to Herbert Hoover, and her opinions about events in the world and theories and so on. And she was a riveting person and a greater influence on me than everybody else in my life put together during the formative stages. And I knew her about 25 years. I eventually became her manager and literary agent, and in the end she adopted me informally as her grandson. I used to call her Grandma, and it's still a little strange for me to call her Rose, because I always did call her Grandma. And she, when she died, she left me her estate, which of course included her mother's, with the expectation I'd carry out a number of commitments she wanted carried out after her death.
And was one of the commitments to carry on the story, her story?
Absolutely not. Not at all. Neither she nor I ever thought about it. I found the manuscript to the first 4 years, the last of Laura's books, amongst Rose's papers, and I edited that one, which was published about 20 years ago, and I thought that was the end. In fact, I said so in the introduction. But people have wanted to, that's the one, exactly. And people have asked me what happened next. Harper wanted me to write a 10th book in that series, but not knowing Laura, I corresponded with her, but I never met her. I thought that would be phony. But the light bulb came on about 4 years ago, and I thought, gee, I know Rose well enough and have all these stories she told me, and verbally and in writing, that I can write about her as a 7-year-old girl and growing up to 17 and get it pretty well right. So the publishers encouraged me to do it, and it took me 3 years to do, but I've done it.
I think reading the book, it's fascinating because we end the first 4 years when Rose is just an infant, and finding out that some of the experiences she had as a very small girl mirrored the experiences of her mother, Laura Ingalls, when she was a little girl, and that continuity is fascinating. I think that whole perspective on history is something that interests children. Obviously, you are a history buff. I think you must have done an enormous amount of research when you started working on the Little House on Rocky Ridge to fill in the personal side with some of the things that actually were going on in society at that time.
Oh, absolutely. The incidents in this are all true. But of course I had to invent bridges. For example, I wasn't there, so how can I say that this conversation between Laura and Rose is exactly the words they said? You have to use common sense and know if that's the situation, this is more or less what they must have said to each other. And you're right, I had an enormous amount of research to do. I've got a pile of papers about that high with my notes on everything, to the least detail. I went out to an organic farm in Ozarks, for example, which I imagine is run somewhat like a farm of 100 years ago, and learned about all the little things like how chickens behave, because I know Rose told about how difficult it was to get their chickens into a hen coop when they first arrived. But I don't know how to describe it because I didn't know how chickens, being a city boy, I didn't know how chickens acted. So I had to go find out.
I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about the Wilder books. There is such detail about daily life that young readers really have a sense of what it was like to be a pioneer, that it was hard work, and women worked very hard, and men worked very hard, and kids worked very hard, and that comes across in the little house on Rocky Ridge too. And it's learning about a culture, the very strong discipline, the independent spirit, and I think this probably sort of mirrors some of perhaps your political ideas, and obviously Rose Wilder Lane was a very independent woman. I was interested in reading a short biography of her, that she'd been a journalist traveling all over Eastern Europe after World War I, and was actually the oldest female journalist in Vietnam in 1965, and she would have been an older woman at the time. So,
late 70s, yeah.
So she didn't just dwell in the past. She must have always been interested in social concerns, social issues. And was that part of the fascination the two of you had for each other, that you both shared those common political ideas?
That was the bottom bond between us. We both wanted to know, find out, analyze, explore, and act on what we knew to the extent that we could. And she went for Women's Day as a war correspondent to Vietnam, and wrote about it from a sort of a woman's perspective, I guess, although she was a feminist herself. She wanted to comment on the war in that magazine. And she had a lot of trouble getting over there because President Johnson and the State Department did not want a 77 or 8-year-old woman on the streets of Saigon.
Well, have you considered, this is getting us quite off the topic of Rocky Ridge, but as a children's librarian, we are always looking for biographies of strong women, and certainly Rose Wilder's Lane's life covers an enormous perspective from pioneer days to the Vietnam War. And as a journalist and a woman, would you consider doing a juvenile biography of her, a nonfiction book?
Yeah, I might do that one day after I do these 5 books. There are going to be 5 of these. And I don't think anymore because I want them all to be rooted in fact. I don't want to make anything up.
So you are actually using the journals that Rose had kept during her childhood and her adult life?
Well, she didn't keep journals during her childhood, but she wrote letters. She was a voluminous correspondent during her lifetime, and she wrote innumerable letters on every subject under the sun to everybody you can imagine, from Herbert Hoover to Leon Trotsky, would you believe?
And did they all answer?
Oh, yes, they did. I don't find any of Trotsky's letters, but I think she told me he did, through a translator, of course. In any event, in lots of those letters, she details some of the things that happened to her as a child. And I used those sources. And her mother, of course, wrote up to Ma, Carolyn, in De Smet, South Dakota, and said, well, this is what's happening to us now in the Ozarks. And Rose wrote books about the Ozarks herself, about young people in the Ozarks, which I know very well were derived from experiences she had had. And the list can go on and on. Old newspapers, the Wilders did thus and so last Sunday. You know, there are innumerable sources.
Small town newspapers keep minute detail on the social life of residents in those communities.
Don't they do, especially then, yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. And then when you started thinking about a series, you worked with Harper to develop a book that's similar in format to the actual Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. I was very interested pulling one of Wilder's books off the shelf The typeface is the same, which of course is going to appeal to children. They're going to find a sense of familiarity. Garth Williams did the black and white drawings in the Wilder series, and the illustrator in your books is very similar.
Yeah, it's David Gillies. This is the first book he's illustrated. And I didn't want a clone of Garth Williams because Garth himself couldn't do it anymore. But I wanted somebody who would reflect the warmth of his style in his own way, and I think David succeeded.
In addition to doing the books, you were also involved with, as a consultant or a creator of the very popular television program.
Well, my partner, Ed Friendly, and I did create that series and sold it to NBC, and it ran for 9 years. And in the beginning, it was based on Laura's books, but after a while, Michael Landon, who was the star, said he wanted to do it his way, and he used made-up stories, but with the same characters, and I must say with the same warmth of family relationship that the books had. In the beginning, I was very disappointed in that. I thought young people would confuse the two and not know what was true and what wasn't. But I got taught a lesson. Many, many young people had come up to me and said, look, we know the books are the true story, and we know this is made-up stories about the same people, but we like them both. We can keep them separate.
I think it's disappointing to children when they've loved a book to find even one word, and anyone who has read books to children knows how quickly they pick up any discrepancies. So that's quite interesting.
Well, they picked up the discrepancy,
sure.
but they just put it in one part of their minds.
I was a little shocked myself that the set did not resemble the Walnut Grove, Minnesota, either in background or setting. There are a number of...
And no beard either.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's not handsome, I suppose, for the star of that program. There are some Laura Ingalls Wilder sites in Minnesota and in DeSmet, South Dakota, of course, that have almost become pilgrimage places for families who love these books. Walnut Grove and Spring Valley has some interesting things in a museum. And of course, Mansfield, I believe, as the, so to speak, keeper of the flame. Do you have any connection with those historical sites and with the way they're maintained or run?
Yeah, I have an informal connection with the South Dakota, DeSmet one. But only that. But I'm a director and have been for 30 years of the Mansfield, Missouri Museum and the home, which is still there. In fact, we have a videotape of it.
I think let's take a look at that right now, and you can describe some of the things when we're watching it.
Okay. This is the house on Rocky Ridge as it looks today. It's the house in which Laura and Almanzo lived out their lives until they died in 1957 and 67. And it backs right on a rocky spring. This is the living room in which they spent their evenings. See those big heavy rocks that outline the fireplace? I've often wondered how they got them in place in the era when they were put up. This is the nook in which Laura wrote her books. That's her library right there. And just around to the right, out of sight, is the desk that she used to write all 9 of them on school pads. This is a picture on the wall in the living room of a Saturday Evening Post illustration of a pioneer novel that Rose wrote in the mid-30s. This explains itself, and the revolver does figure in Little House on Rocky Ridge as they arrive at their new farm. This is the writing desk that they brought down from South Dakota. Laura kept her diary on the way, and it hides an amazing secret, which I will not reveal. This is the sewing desk that, or kit or cabinet that Almanzo made for Laura. In those days, they had to do their own sewing, and she needed a place to keep her needles and threads and buttons. This is the road now grassed over that led from town of Mansfield to the little house on Rocky Ridge, and back and forth on which Almanzo took first wood and then later apples to town. This is called Fry Creek, and it borders the Wilder property. This was taken actually in July of 1983, and a little bit dry, but Rose went down there and hunted for crawdads and frogs and the like, and played as any young kid would do in the water. This was a field in which there were planted many apple trees, which bore the fruit that supported the family in part in later years. But now, when this picture was taken in 1983, the apple trees are all gone, and it's now pasture for horses and cattle and the like. And I'm sure Rose played in that field a lot. And of course, Laura and Almanzo worked in it. What you just seen, of course, was the house that was built a bit after they bought the farm on Rocky Ridge. And this is what it looked like when they bought it. This is Almanzo in the back of the wagon in which they brought their possessions down from South Dakota, and the horses, Pet and May, and the edge of the cabin which they found there. And you can see in the corner there's a window which I describe how Almanzo cut the logs and fitted that so that Laura could look out and watch the changing scene. Then later they built the house I showed a few minutes ago. There's another picture that might be of some interest. A little bit later, Rose goes to school. And her father, Almanzo, didn't want her to walk all the time. So he bought her a donkey. And this is the donkey, which Rose named Spookendike. And Rose had a love-hate relationship with him, Gretchen, because when she went to saddle him, he'd suck in his breath, like, so that his belly was big. And then Rose would cinch down the saddle buckles, and then when she had the saddle down, he'd go, and let out the air, so the saddle was loose. And if he wanted to stop on the way to school when they were trotting along, he would do so, and suddenly, by just putting his feet forward, full stop, and the saddle would move forward, catch behind those ears that you see there, and Rose, being caught unaware, would go right over the top of the donkey's head and down on her butt on the ground.
Well, she does have a look of not absolute affection as she holds him.
That's right.
That's a wonderful story, and that's the kind of story she would tell you when you were sitting around. Well, obviously, you know, to translate that then into the books would be a terrific way of maintaining that past. We were talking a little before the program about one of the reasons I think children love the Wilder books and why they will enjoy these books is there is a sense of family, a sense of tradition, a sense of warmth and love, and certainly material things play very little part. The few treasures the families have are cherished. The breadboard, Ma's breadboard, or I imagine it was quite a step up when Almanzo was able to buy a donkey for Rose to ride to school.
And they had to consider selling the horses that brought them down in the beginning, so it was some kind of a step up. And you're right, the family stayed together because they worked together, and they frequently played together. They worked together because they had to. You couldn't survive. The children had, as soon as they were able, had to learn to do simple chores around the farm in order to relieve the parents. And as they got older, they shouldered more and more of the burden, and enjoyed it because they'd work alongside their parents. They'd share what there was to know about the nature and
the self-esteem that the child got seems in these books to come from doing a job well, and praise was sparely given. It wasn't just this constant.
You were expected to do it and learn your place in the world, and they did. And they loved their parents, but as parents, not as pals or anything of that sort. It was mutual respect and love, and working together and playing together. You know, the family would often go off fishing together, all of them, and maybe with neighbors and their children, or picnicking someplace.
Or the violin,
in the
singing
evenings.
in the evenings.
Sure, the violin would play, or they'd pop popcorn over the fire and tell stories.
I think one of the really poignant scenes in Little House on Rocky Ridge was when the family was moving from DeSmet, Almanzo, Laura, and Rose, down to Missouri. Pa told Laura that when the time came, his violin would be hers, and her reaction was just to say, "Oh, Pa." And of course, Pa's violin figured so prominently in the whole first series. And is it going to come into play in your series too?
No, because it didn't come down till after this series is over. I got it down from the Pier, that's how they pronounce it, the capital of South Dakota, Pier Museum, maybe 30 years ago, and it's been in Rocky Ridge, and that's where it is now. We had it restored, Gretchen, a year or so ago when the house became a national historical monument. It's been restrung, and we got somebody from Branson, Missouri to play it. This would be in 1982, the summer of. And we made a cassette of the playings, which can be bought. the little bookshop there sells all kinds of books and related items like that, the profits from which go to help us restore the place as
So
it
it's
was.
Pa's violin playing the songs that he
Yes.
played, Camptown Races.
Yeah. And the pop goes
even
the
Ta Ra Ra
weasel.
Boom Die. I was interested in the way that the music changed just a little bit. Rose seemed to bring it up to date a little bit more when.
Yeah, sure. I
when
tried
she got
to,
to be.
advance the thing. And that's what most people will find interesting about this series. There are other series of children's books, like the Babysitter's Club, which deal with contemporary issues, divorce, drinking, popularity in school, that sort of thing. But they're always, each book has a different set of characters. This isn't. This is one person, Rose, growing up over about a 10-year period, and how her life changes, her perspective changes, how the community changes, so that you can see one development of one character principally, and of course her parents and the people around her as well.
Well, it is, and some of the technological changes that happens. For instance, when they drive into, I think it's Topeka,
Yes.
and here's this amazing road, and it looks like black rubber, and there's no dust, and Mama finds out it cost $25,000, and there's just this shock of how could a city spend that much just on a road?
I should point out that 25,000 then was more like $500,000
Well,
a day, but
certainly,
even so,
certainly.
yes, of course. And you remember how the horses' hooves made holes and then they would just come back?
Right, and that was something that I didn't understand myself.
Well, as a kid, I used to do that. I lived in a community with asphalt, and we stick our fingers in and just watch it come back up. Fun.
And then when Almanzo found this terrific deal, 10 cents for the asbestos stovetop things, that Mama was a little concerned about, because 10 cents doesn't come very easy.
That's right. But he used it to supplement their income and buy food as they went.
Well, one of the things you talked about was women doing the sewing for the family and doing some other handiwork. And you brought an example of some of Laura's handiwork.
No, this is
Or
Rose's
it
handiwork, actually. And as I mentioned earlier, you had to, you didn't buy clothes, you made them out of cloth, but it wasn't all just journeyman stuff that you did from day to day. Of course, the ladies wanted to do some decorative work, like little lace around their collars for going to church. And they made quilts and throws of various kinds. And this is crochet work. You started with this a ball of whatever this is, string, twine, would you call it, or light string, whatever. And you made, or Rose made this one, this little, what would you call it, a doily-like
Well,
thing?
something a doily that you'd put on the table for decoration. Or
And then,
now, this would be something that she learned from her mother.
oh
Laura,
yeah, her mother taught her all kinds of needlework. In fact, Rose wrote a book about needleworking some time ago. I'm trying to get it back in print. Then you'd sew those together. You see, each of these is the same as that. And the ladies would sew those together. And then they would have another one, exactly the same. And they would go together kind of like that. As you can see, they would, you'd sew these together laterally. And then more and more and more of them, depending on what you were making. Rose, this is called the popcorn pattern, according to Rose, my grandmother. And she made me a quilt. And I said, Grandma, how many stitches are in this? And she said, I knew you'd ask that question, Roger. 4 million, give or take 20,000. I haven't been able to use it,
An amazing piece of work and a real heirloom and treasure. We've got a few minutes left, and I don't want to end on a negative note, but there's been some discussion in the field. There is a book called Children of Promise, Days of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I understand that there is a new book that suggests that Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't actually write the books, that Rose had done it. And I wonder if you could just briefly comment on that.
Sure, of course Laura wrote the books. Her original handwritten manuscripts exist. And anybody can look at them that wants to. What happened, of course, was that Rose was a world-famous writer before her mother began these books. And in some cases, Rose, as she told me, rolled my mother's manuscript through the typewriter. That was her phrase for doing editing work, changing the pacing.
Well, you must have had an editor yourself on Little House on Rocky Ridge.
I tell you, this book wouldn't be what it is without Erin Gathrin, who was my editor. Without her help, I just wouldn't be anywhere near as good. And I think Rose helped her mother in that respect. But the books are all Laura's. The stories are all true, and they're all Laura's stories.
And certainly Rose, as the daughter whose career was journalism, could have encouraged her mother to write down the stories.
Very definitely.
that's
She
how
said, these can't be
it
lost,
happened.
Ma. Why don't you... she called her Mama Bess for reasons that her her father's sister was also an Elizabeth, so they had to differentiate.
Well,
Mama Bess, you can't lose
me.
these stories.
So you're planning 6 more books now, and you'll
4 more after this.
Are you speaking to groups of children in schools and answering some of their questions about both Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane?
I certainly expect to be doing that. I haven't yet. I've been just, as we speak, in the summer of 1993, the book has just been published, and I've been going from city to city to bookstores where I demonstrate frontier games and this sort of stuff to the kids and show pictures and play the violin of Pa, the recording of, and then answer their questions. They come in sometimes 40 or 50 of them, sometimes 200.
Well, I would expect you'll be getting letters from children, especially when children realize that you knew the real Rose Wilder Lane. Roger, it's been a pleasure having you on the program today. Thank you very much for coming, and the half hour went very fast.
There was so much more we could say.
That's certainly.
Thanks, Gretchen.
You're welcome. Families who've enjoyed reading the Laura Ingalls Wilder books together may enjoy the continuation written by Roger Lea MacBride in The Little House on Rocky Ridge. Thank you, Roger, and thanks to all of you for joining us in All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.